Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Grand Magistrix Elisande in the Nighthold.
Yes, this three-phase encounter is definitely one of the more challenging fights in the instance, and it's just full of one-shot mechanics. However, most of these abilities can be dealt with pretty easily by just decent positioning and good communication. So understanding how the more deadly abilities work and organising how you're going to deal with them before you even pull the boss will certainly save you a lot of wipes.
So let's get straight into it. Now in all phases the boss will spawn two different adds, a slow elemental, which are the blue ones, and a fast elemental, which are the pink ones. Both of these adds must be picked up by your tank, and do note that both can spawn at the exact same time. The blue adds have an interruptible cast that deals increasing damage each time it is cast, so you need to make sure that you have a 3-person interrupt rotation to counter this. You'll want to be killing these blue guys first. As for the pink guys, they just deal an ever increasing amount of AoE damage to your raid. And on top of this, the boss also deals unavoidable AoE damage throughout the entire fight, so this is where your healers are tested. Now when either ad dies, they'll leave a bubble on the ground, and entering this bubble will give you a debuff. The blue bubble will slow you for 30 seconds, this reduces your casting speed, your movement speed, attack speed, dot tick rates, cooldown recharge, but most importantly, will also slow down any debuffs on you, and this is really important for the last phase. As for the pink bubble, it will instead increase everything that we just listed for 30 seconds. While killing these adds, it's vital that they're not killed on top of each other, because you'll want these bubbles to be spread apart. That way you can easily access the bubble without receiving the wrong debuff. And do note that if you do pick up the wrong debuff, let's say you pick up the slow one, if you move into the fast puddle, it will simply just remove it. They overwrite each other. And typically for almost every single phase, you'll just want to keep the fast buff up for as much as you possibly can, just so you have more output. But the main reason why you want to keep these bubbles spread is because of our kinetic ring. When the boss casts this ability, it will spawn a large amount of orbs all around the outside of the room, completely encasing you within them. These orbs will then begin to collapse directly towards the boss, who has now teleported to a random area of the room. Being hit by these orbs is really bad as they do an absolutely huge amount of damage, so instead you're forced to avoid them. You can blink over them, or ultimately, if you are stuck, you can just use a personal damage reduction to pass through them. However, these orbs are affected by the slow and the fast patches. So when the ring spawns, you'll already want to be by the slow patch. As soon as the orbs on either side of the bubble have passed by, you can move through the gap that has now been generated by the slow bubble, as the orbs that are passing through the bubble are now significantly slower. Now the boss will cast the Arkinetic ring on a timer, but occasionally she'll actually cast it twice in a row. This isn't problematic providing the blue adds die fast and you're always stood by the newest bubble that has formed, as old bubbles have a habit of despawning just before a new ring has been cast. And like I just mentioned, should probably point this out again, just so it is clear, if you are caught out and there's no way that you're going to make it to the gap in time, it's best to simply just move straight through the ring using a damage reduction, because if you're only hit by a single orb and it only ticks once, it's not going to kill you. However, if you're like slow and you hesitate or you get hit by multiple orbs, it's very likely that you're going to die. In this phase, you'll also have spanning singularity patches that spawn. 3 large void zones will appear on top of players that shortly afterwards will explode. You need to make sure that you move from them. After the explosion, a puddle will be left behind. These puddles last the entire fight, and if they're not removed, they'll block areas of the room. If you stand inside these puddles, you'll take a large amount of ticking damage, but it'll also cause the puddles to slowly shrink, and if you stand inside them long enough, it will finally despawn. Now the tick rate of these puddles is actually affected by your slow and your fast buff, so we recommend that you only slow these puddles when the Arkinetic rings are on cooldown, and you have either no debuff at all, or the slow one. It is possible to soak them with the fast buff, but it's going to require some very strong spot healing on these targets. Ultimately though, if you play this fight very well, there isn't really any other points where you need to use a personal cooldown or use an immunity, so you could use these instead to soak the patches. To add, your tanks don't need to swap too much on Elisande, so one of them can spend a long time soaking as well. And talking about tanks, the only last thing you need to worry about in this phase is the dot that the boss applies to you, called Ablation. This debuff in this phase is very simple, it just stacks up, you just need to make sure you taunt off each other to keep the stack as low as possible. We do it roughly around the 4 stack range.
Now once you've got the hang of dealing with all of those abilities, and you've managed to nail down the ring timers, you'll enter phase 2 once the boss reaches around 10% health. She'll freeze time and re-enter the room with 100% health. In this phase, she'll continue to spawn adds, so you need to kill the slow ones first and make sure that the bubbles are spread apart, and she'll also still use her ring ability. However, instead of the rings moving towards the boss, it will instead go to copies of herself around the room. You need to deal with them in the exact same way, just be ready to move into smaller gaps. Now what is different however is the tank debuff. It will now leave a single debuff that will explode when it times out. This explosion deals damage to the entire raid, it is however reduced the further away players are from you. As soon as you receive the debuff, you want to move as far away from the raid as possible. However, do keep an eye on your timers, as this debuff can expire at the same time orbs spawn. If you happen to be miles away from a slow bubble because you're dropping your debuff, you'll easily get caught out by the ring of orbs. You can either save a cooldown for this or just simply run through one of the orbs, or stick with the raid and use a healing cooldown to compensate for the raid taking damage. Just make sure that you taunt off each other so the boss doesn't travel with you as you're exploding your debuff away from the raid. Now, added into this phase is 2 new abilities. On a timer, orbs will spawn in the air, spread evenly around the room in different locations. These orbs will slowly descend towards the ground, and once they do reach the ground, they'll do a huge burst of damage to the entire raid. This damage is lethal, as all of the orbs will hit the ground at the exact same time. However, if a player stands within the targeting circle, that player will take the burst of damage instead, preventing the raid from being one-shot. So the moment they spawn, have classes with high mobility go and soak them. We assign our mages and our hunters to deal with them, but really any class can deal with it. And lastly, you have the Delpheric Beam. The boss on a timer will pick random players within the raid and mark them with a debuff. The boss will also point an arrow towards these players. After the debuff times out, the boss will fire a beam of arcane energy at them, dealing damage to anyone within the arrow line as well as behind the player. The best way to deal with this ability is making sure that all the players with the beam aren't stacked, and as soon as you've worked that out, just have those players stand still. Then players that are not targeted can simply move out of the way of those players. Now, this ability comes in sets of 2, so using a healing cooldown each time in larger raid sizes definitely isn't a bad idea. So aside from these 2 abilities you now have to deal with, the strat in this phase remains very much the same. You want to kill the blue and pink adds fast, making sure that their bubbles are spread. You want to be near the blue bubble when the ring is cast, and keep in mind the orbs will now fly towards the copies of the boss rather than the boss herself. Tanks, try your best to have the debuff expire away from the raid. You need to soak the patches on the ground using the slow buff or your damage reductions or immunities, and you want to soak the orbs that appear around the room whilst you're watching out for the arrows that appear around the boss when she casts Delpheric Beam.
And once you've got the hang of all of that, which is quite a lot, she'll then leave the encounter at 10%, freeze time, and then return for a final time at 100% health, and this is when the last phase begins. In this last phase, you'll have everything from the previous phases, so everything that Alex just listed. Also, the tank debuff in this phase is now applied by an interruptible cast. The cast itself does quite a lot of damage, and the debuff simply just amplifies this damage by 10%, and this stacks up permanently. So it's really important that every single cast is interrupted, otherwise the tanks are just going to flat out get one shot at some point. We set up a simple interrupt rotation of 2 melee players and have a single ranged backup for when the boss is moving or from when we're moving from orbs. To add, this phase also has 2 new abilities that come in the form of 2 different debuffs. One of the debuffs is very simple, it's just a short duration dot that increases in damage. Healers, you just need to keep an eye on these targets and make sure they get a little bit more additional healing, but the most important one is Conflexive Burst. As this phase goes on, this debuff will be applied to more and more targets. The debuff itself lasts 30 seconds, and while you have it, it does nothing at all. However, when it expires, you do a burst of damage to the raid. For the first set of debuffs, it doesn't really matter because it's only on a single player. However, on the second set of debuffs and every single one after that point, it becomes a problem because more debuffs are active, they're all going to expire at the exact same time, and your raid will simply be one shot. You can, however, adjust the duration of these debuffs by using the slow and fast bubbles, like we said at the start of the guide. So when multiple debuffs are applied to your raid, you'll want to call out on the fly which player should move into either the slow or the fast bubbles. That way their debuffs will expire at different times, giving you enough time to top up people between the explosions. Towards the end of the fight, where you have 3 or 4 or even 5 people with the debuff, you'll need to do it the exact same way, but you need to make sure that they enter the bubbles in a staggered fashion. If you tell half of them to go slow and half of them to go fast and they all enter at the exact same time, you're still going to have explosions go off at the same time. So you need to make sure that they slowly enter the bubbles one by one with a couple of seconds gap between. But you've got to make sure that you don't spend too much time in this phase, because eventually the boss will apply the debuff to absolutely everyone, and this is the Harden Rage. When all these debuffs come out, if they are on every single person in your raid, you just need to jump into the slow bubble and just hope that you survive. There's nothing else you can really do. But that's everything in this phase. Of course, we're making it sound quite simple because there is everything else that you need to deal with at the exact same time. You still need to make sure you're killing the ads. You still need to make sure you use the bubbles for the rings. You need to soak the puddles of shit on the ground. You need to soak the orbs that spawn in the air. You need to make sure you spot heal all the dot targets as well as all the other AoE damage that's coming in, as well as keeping the boss interrupted for the tanks. And of course, dealing with these complexive burst debuffs.
So there is quite a lot going on.
Oh yeah.
But phase 1 and 2 do set you up for phase 3. So when you're dealing with the orbs for the first time in phase 1, it can seem like quite a big task, but by the time you get to phase 3, it's kind of like second nature. You just know what to do with these orbs and you can deal with them very quickly, and it kind of works the same way with all of the mechanics, so you'll get through it eventually.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide helps you out at all, then please do drop us down a like, it helps us out a lot, and subscribe for more videos and click the notification bell to see when those videos are coming out. And also a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are the best, and we shall see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.